Nothing indicates at first that anyone wanted these papers to survive. The trace should no longer exist. When Paul Deforge opens this old oak box, he does not expect to find this. 4 impeccably preserved Panama bonds and a bank receipt that should not exist. Paul Deforge, a financial analyst, leafs through the box's papers at his kitchen table. He touches the thick paper, the elegant letterheads, the reassuring wording. These are lottery bonds from the Panama Canal Company, issued for the general public. Yet on the receipt, a pencil note, recommended by Deputy L, a deputy who, officially, had no connection with these investments. The discrepancy catches his attention. The note haunts him. Paul types the deputy's name into his computer, digs through digitized archives, comes across parliamentary debates, then a word that keeps recurring: Panama. Everything seems to correspond to the great bankruptcy of the Compagnie Universelle in 1889. Everything, except for one detail. One of the securities in his box was subscribed after an issue presented as the ultimate appeal to the public, supposedly strictly supervised by the state. Yet in his great-grandfather's banking file, Paul finds a private circular, without official stamp, promising almost guaranteed gains. It bears the same signature as that of an elected official who publicly advocated caution. Paul starts with the simplest explanation. Hypothesis A, reassuring. His great-grandfather would have been a victim like the others. A provincial saver, seduced by the prestige of Ferdinand de Lesseps and by the promise of a second Suez. The deposit banks distributed these securities at the counter. The newspapers praised a future of interoceanic tolls easily covering the interest. The financial engineering seemed classic. Shares, bonds, lottery loans, all validated by the competent ministries. The deputy mentioned on the receipt? Perhaps just a family friend, offering a disinterested tip with no compensation. In this scenario, no one directly manipulates his ancestor. He is mistaken on his own, trusting, like hundreds of thousands of other French people, in a project presented as legal, supervised, almost patriotic. This hypothesis blows up when Paul comes across an internal memo from a major bank, kept in the archives. The exact name of this deputy appears there on a list of paid parliamentary supporters. The money did not circulate around his great-grandfather. It passed over his head. He shifts to another trail. Hypothesis B, more complex. The trap was not only financial, it was institutional. Paul reconstructs the scheme. In Paris, the Compagnie Universelle was not only promising a canal, it was selling a political story. The canal did not commit the French treasury, but the authorizations for bond lotteries depended on ministers, deputies, the Senate. Officially, everything went through laws, decrees, reports. Unofficially, the survival of the construction site depended on a network of intertwined interests. Banks paid by commissions, newspapers greased with advertising money, elected officials approached to support the essential bills. In this setup, it is no longer finance that buys a bit of politics. It is politics that becomes the condition for finance's survival. Paul combs through the debates. The same elected officials who present themselves as guardians of small savers' money vote for the bills authorizing new lottery loans, even as costs are already exploding. In the company's accounts, vague line items swell. Advertising expenses, relations. The further he goes, the more he feels that the state is not protecting savers. It is protecting the continuity of the project, even if it means letting the fresh money of small investors plug gaping holes in Panama. Then he comes across the liquidation minutes. The creditors are sorted, classified. Bond after bond, small investors appear in droves, drowned. The state, for its part, loses nothing financially. It has only lent its signature for the authorizations. What Paul initially believed, that political power had been taken advantage of by an overly ambitious company, reverses. Parliament is not subjected to the system. It holds the key to it. Hypothesis C, disturbing. Paul begins to wonder whether the heart of the scandal is not corruption, but the tacit acceptance of an arrangement. The elected officials knew that by authorizing new loans, they were pushing back the inevitable and transferring the risk to people like his great-grandfather. The commissions, The envelopes would then be only the surface of a deeper pact, saving the image of French power, whatever the cost for those who put in their savings. Until the moment when Paul discovers a sticking point that no one in his family has ever mentioned. By staring at numbers for so long, Paul ends up looking for a place. He goes to the departmental archives where his great-grandfather lived. In a cold room under a white light, they bring him a yellowed bank ledger. He follows the line of his name, finds the Panama subscriptions, then, further on, a terse note. Liquidation, no value, nothing else. No recourse, no handwritten explanation. Just this notation that crushes 2 decades of savings. The wall is not technical. It is not in Panama, among the rusted dredgers and water-filled trenches. It is here, between the amount invested column and the recovered column. To understand how they got there, Paul traces his way back to the Chamber of Deputies, to the precise moment when everything tips, the request for a new issue of lottery bonds. The technical reports are already worrying. The cost overruns are known in certain circles. Yet the company still presents itself as a viable entity, carried by the dream of a sea-level canal, then by a late shift toward a lock system. The elected officials face a brutal choice: authorize a new appeal to popular savings or cut off the life support. On one side, thousands of jobs on the construction site, industrial contracts, flows of capital to Central America. On the other, the acknowledged risk of trapping more small investors. This is not an abstraction for Paul. In a file, he finds a collective letter from local notables pressuring their deputy to support the project in the name of national prestige. That day, the wall rises. Private money is used to keep a public symbol alive. When the chamber refuses to authorize the loan, the company collapses. Officially, the institutions have held firm. They have refused to go any further. But for those who have already invested, the refusal is not a protection, it is a sentence. His great-grandfather's securities become almost instantly worthless. What strikes Paul is not the bankruptcy itself, it is the silence that follows. No trace of any attempt at compensation by the state. The losses are declared private. Yet access to these investments was made possible, structured, by public decisions. Reading through the trials, Paul detects another kind of wall, the one erected by accounting categories. The sums paid to political intermediaries are drowned in anonymous headings. Public relations expenses. It is under this label that what allowed laws to pass, decrees to be signed, newspapers to publish reassuring ads, is smuggled in. At no point in the official figures sent to bondholders are these amounts isolated as a moral risk. And then there is the wall, much more intimate, that his great-grandfather seems to have encountered alone. Paul finds a personal notebook, covered in tight handwriting. A few sentences mention the canal, the pride of having taken part in a great French undertaking. Then, from the bankruptcy onward, almost nothing. Then a note, terse. No longer talk about Panama in front of the children. Paul clings to a material detail. According to a local newspaper clipping, subscribers would sometimes come in person to the branch to collect their interest coupons. After the bankruptcy, the article mentions interrupted lines, people sent home. It describes fingers clenched around bundles of now unsellable securities, the paper crumpling, sometimes tearing against the wood of the counter. It is this physical contact that obsesses Paul. That moment when a hand extends a piece of paper, hoping for a banknote in return, and meets emptiness. Behind this gesture, there is a whole system closing in. The banks invoke legality. The newspapers invoke good faith. The elected officials invoke technical complexity. Each shields themselves behind a different wall. He, behind his screen, tries to follow the money flows, but he always comes back to the same point. The decision to let the company go back, again and again, to the savings of people who had no real way of assessing what was happening on the ground. Everything else, the dredgers, the locomotives, the hospitals, the rails, is only the costly backdrop to a mechanism in which the risk was pushed as far away as possible, to the very last outstretched hand. Financial historians now generally agree that the Panama scandal, above all, illustrates a failure of oversight and transparency. rather than a single conspiracy orchestrated from the shadows. Other researchers, for their part, insist that parliamentary corruption was exaggerated by the press of the time, and that many of the accused deputies never received a single franc, which further blurs the line between manipulation, rumor, and judicial reality. All of them, however, refuse to go too far with an idea that Paul sees taking shape. The fear that this case might recall that political power was not only penetrated by private money, but that it used this flow to test, almost without admitting it, how far ordinary people's savings could absorb the shock of a national failure. A certain vagueness lingers in these conclusions. By cross-checking the archives, Paul finally manages to establish the full trajectory of the money that left that oak box. His great-grandfather's payments feed the local subscriptions, pass through a major deposit bank, reach the company's coffers in Paris, then fly off toward the Isthmus of Panama. There, they are transformed into wages paid to Caribbean or European workers, into dredgers that get bogged down in the mud, into rails that will have to be torn up a few years later. A portion dissolves into taxes paid to the Colombian government. Another portion flows back to Paris in the form of commissions, advertising contracts, checks handed out by intermediaries. Nothing along this tortuous path ever finds its way back into his great-grandfather's pocket. Paul realizes that the illusion he has been pursuing from the beginning does not concern only his family. His starting point, almost naive, was simple. He believed that the Panama scandal had revealed the true face of power, a clear before and after. Before, a regime perhaps imprudent but basically honest. After, a mask torn off, deputies unmasked, bankers put on trial, stricter laws to prevent the same scenario from happening again. As he goes on, this line grows blurred. In the trials, he reads of convictions, names branded for life, careers shattered. He also reads of acquittals, dismissals, cases dropped. The banks, shaken in their reputation, nonetheless continue to dominate the collection of savings. The newspapers implicated for their complacency continue to be published, sometimes strengthened by the scandal. Parliament, attacked from all sides, weathers the storm and reshapes itself without a change of regime. What collapses for him, abruptly, is the idea that a scandal of this magnitude necessarily forces power to change its nature. Paul plunges back into the files of the following years. He finds traces of reforms, debates over lottery loans, procedural adjustments. He also finds this troubling continuity. The use of ordinary people's savings to finance major projects is not abandoned. It simply becomes more regulated, more cautious in appearance. The same general pattern persists. A state that does not want to commit its budget directly, companies that officially bear the risk, citizens invited to behave like investors without having access to the same information. His attention then shifts to power itself. At the beginning of his investigation, he imagined a clear opposition. On one side, money. On the other, the Republic. In the end, he mainly sees an interweaving. Elected officials are not only targets of corruption, they are also architects of financial instruments, facilitators of subscription campaigns, orators who, at the podium, wrap a risky product in a discourse of national grandeur. For him, the true face of power that emerges is anything but spectacular. It is not made up of conspirators in smoke-filled rooms, but of people who constantly arbitrate between prestige, political stability, and the concrete protection of individuals. In the Panama affair, this pendulum swung toward prestige and continuity, to the detriment of those who were signing subscription orders in provincial branches. Paul returns to the box. He thinks of the treaty by which, much later, the United States would buy out the assets of the new company, take up the studies, equipment, partially built sections, and eventually open the canal to world traffic. The French capital swallowed up in the first venture becomes, at a distance, a kind of involuntary stake for a foreign power. His securities, on the other hand, remain relics with no market value. For a long time, he wanted to believe that his investigation would help rehabilitate his great-grandfather, to show that he had been deceived by a few corrupt individuals, identifiable, isolable. He discovers something else. His ancestor was caught up in a system in which the state, finance, and the press moved forward together, each with its own justifications, but all in the service of a project that did not allow for failure, right up until the moment it collapsed on those who decided nothing. He closes the files, asking himself a single question that abruptly cuts through the noise of the archives. When a political power can make citizens who see only brochures and speeches bear the cost of its ambitions, at what point does it really stop being different from those it claims to regulate? On the table, the Panama bonds are spread out, their papers slightly polished by Paul's fingers. The late afternoon light reveals the watermarks, the printed signatures, the patterns of a calm sea around a perfectly drawn canal. Behind the window, a commuter train rumbles past, regular, without plume or flag. A cup of coffee cools next to the securities, leaving a brown ring on a photocopy of a parliamentary debate. In the open box, at the bottom, a small black notebook remains closed, its elastic taut, as if no one had yet dared to force its binding.